Hi, my name is James Cook. I'm with the University of Maine at Augusta, and today we're going to consider social science research in context. How do we understand what it means to engage in a social science approach to research? Well, we're going to consider that in the context of some other approaches to inquiry, other approaches to gaining knowledge that are very different from a social science approach, and yet that are very much accepted within the modern university system. The interesting thing about universities is that in the quest for knowledge, there are so many different ways to look for knowledge. For instance, we could take a look at the Christian Bible, the Gospel according to Mark, quoting Jesus Christ in chapter 9, verse 43. And if thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter into life maimed than having two hands to go into hell, into the fire that never shall be quenched, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. And if thy foot offend thee, cut it off. For it is better for thee to enter halt into life, than having 2 feet to be cast into hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched. And if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out. Now, is Jesus actually asking his followers to take out their eyes, to cut off their hands, and to cut off their feet if they find that their eyes, their feet, their hands offend them in some way? I don't think so necessarily literally. There's something else that he's saying there. What is it that he's trying to say? In order to find that out, there are a few ways that we could interpret a religious text on its own terms. The first might be to engage in introspection and to think about what those words mean and to wait for some kind of personal inspiration and then to share that personal inspiration with others. A second approach is to look at what religious authorities might say and to note what different councils and different groups of bishops might say, what famous writers such as Thomas Aquinas might say about such a passage, and to respect those opinions and to note those traditions. A third approach might be to treat the Holy Bible as a piece of somewhat consistent literature. What is Mark thinking as an author? What is he trying to say? What is he trying to say about Jesus Christ as a figure, as a character, as a literary character? Now that can be a controversial approach to knowledge within religion, but it begins to enter the same kind of territory as Jane Austen, who in the first passage of Pride and Prejudice says in the first line, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." Now, does Jane Austen really believe that that is a truth universally acknowledged? What is she really trying to say there? It's been argued by literary scholars that she's engaged in a form of irony, of saying something that she actually doesn't mean, or saying something that may not be universally acknowledged. She wants us to think about this, and she wants us to ask, who's it acknowledged by? Well, is it acknowledged by these very wealthy men, these single wealthy men? Not necessarily. Is it a truth acknowledged by young women? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. How do we know the answers to these questions? We read on. That's one answer. And we can look at the characters who act out this maxim. Do they hold close to that maxim? Do they try to run away from that maxim? And what happens to them? We can begin to get the author's point of view by looking at what the characters do. And we can interpret the meaning of that passage in that light. We can also begin to think about the context that Jane Austen wrote that passage in. She wrote it in a time where fortunes, estates were entailed to male heirs and not to female heirs, meaning that there was a great deal of dependency among young women who were not married. So within that context, the meaning of that phrase takes on a different hue. And we should understand it as a product of Jane Austen's time. So that is a kind of search for knowledge that treats the novel and the novelist at once as self-contained units who may have certain characteristics, but also begins to look beyond the novel itself. We can't actually prove that what Jane Austen meant because we don't have definitive evidence, but we can make arguments by analogy, we can make arguments by context, we can suppose, and we can build a good sounding argument. I want to talk about a different kind of document. This is LD 341. That stands for Legislative Document 341 in the Maine State Legislature of 2015. And it reads in part, the state tax assessor shall adopt rules to determine the income or loss for a corporation that is a member of a unitary group that is not otherwise required to file a consolidated federal return and to prevent double taxation or double deduction of any amount included in the computation of net income under the Maine Revised Statutes, Title 36, Section 5200, Subsection 5. Rules adopted pursuant to this section are major substantive rules as described in Title 5, Chapter 375, Subchapter 2-A. What does that mean? On its own, on its face, I'm not sure. I don't have knowledge about what that actually means. Just as for the biblical passage, if I take it literally as a command to amputate, I think I'm not getting the real core knowledge. But here, for a legal document, what does it mean? What am I trying to find in terms of knowledge? Well, I have a number of clues. First, I have a set of definitions. So, unitary group, corporation, state tax assessor, major substantive rule, computation of net income, double taxation, double deduction. In order to understand the law, I need to know a set of definitions of terms in Maine state law. And if I understand those, I can begin to understand that passage. The second thing I need to do is I need to look at particular laws that are modified by this bill, this piece of legislation. So I need to look at Title 36, Section 5200, Subsection 5, and Title 5, Chapter 375, Subchapter 2A, in order to know exactly what is being talked about and what is being proposed. So, to gain knowledge in a legal sense, if I am a lawyer, means to know the meaning of words very specifically as they apply to the law, not what I would like them to mean, not what I think the world should be like, but what the current understanding of the law is as measured in titles and sections and subsections of Maine state law, and where the understanding of that definition is a little fuzzy, what legal authority rules. And understanding that legal authority, the judge, and understanding their rulings and the precedents they set is a way for us to gain legal knowledge. It doesn't matter if it's good. It doesn't matter if it's just. It doesn't matter if it actually describes a state that occurs outside the law. What matters is what the law describes. Finally, social science document, a set of papers. That's mostly what social science research comes in. It comes in the unit of a published paper in an academic journal. And the knowledge that is gained here is of a very different sort. It's not a religious document. It's not a literary document. It's not a legal document. Instead, it's a scientific document. And so it needs to be read knowing what that document is going to provide. It's going to describe a problem that's going to be outlined in an introduction. It's going to describe what other people, clever people, in a literature review have thought about that problem, how they have tackled that problem, and how they have tackled the pursuit of knowledge regarding that problem. Then there's going to be a section that describes how the authors of this paper are going to go in their own direction, and they're going to propose their own solution, or they're going to implement somebody else's solution in a new way to gain knowledge. What is this knowledge about? Typically, it's knowledge about an outcome of interest regarding a phenomenon of some interest. So the first step that a social scientist will engage in is not asking a judge what they think about it, not asking what the context of authorship is, what their character is, what their motivations might be as a scientist. It's not asking for a religious ruling. Instead, the goal is to engage in measurement. Measurement of as specific a quality as possible. And so part of the challenge of research is to describe the outcome you're interested in so specifically that everyone who reads your work will agree with you that that's a good measurement of that outcome. Then, if we're interested in that outcome, we're going to try to figure out what other sorts of factors might lead to changes in that outcome. What can make it go one way versus another? What can make it vary? That outcome is called a dependent variable, because its outcome depends on other variables, other observable aspects of the world around us, observations not of literature, not of legal documents, not of religious documents, but of the world outside of books. And in that observation of the world outside of books, finding things that vary that affect other things that vary. In other words, a number of independent variables that are associated with change in the dependent variable, the thing whose value depends on those other variables. The goal of research is therefore to try to measure that specifically, to describe very specifically how someone else might measure it, how to put that measurement into operation, which is called operationalization. And going through operationalization, find that you can replicate that study. That what I do today, if I describe it specifically enough, and if I describe the problem in an observable fashion that can be observed in multiple different times, in multiple different places, we can begin to look around us and see what the world around us tells us, what the pattern is there, not the pattern in a book, not a pattern in a legal document, not a pattern in a judicial argument. That is the goal of the scientific enterprise in general. And in social science, the goal is therefore to describe a set of phenomena that are social, that are about people in interactions, groups in interactions, institutions in interactions, nations in interaction. And through those interactions, to observe how something about that interaction leads to some other outcome that is meaningful, that is important. That's a difference from all these other kinds of inquiry. There are many paths to knowledge. And which path to knowledge you choose depends on the kind of answer you want. Do you want to understand a story? Do you want to understand a legal document or legal standing of your client? Do you want to understand your own religious tradition or the religious tradition of another within its own worldview? Depending on your answer to that, you may choose literature, you may choose the law, you may choose theology as an area of study. If you're interested in understanding what happens in an observable fashion in the world around you, you choose the tools of science, and those tools of science can be applied to interactions between individuals. That's what social research is.